Welcome to NextLabs Expert Q&A Series. This series was designed to inform you of relevant cybersecurity topics via expert knowledge.
Welcome to episode 26 of the NextLabs Cybersecurity Expert Series, How to Strengthen Data Security in the Cloud. In this episode, we'll explore how Zero Trust principles are transforming cloud security and governance. Let's begin with a short introduction from our speaker, Higham, before we get started.
Hi, I'm Higham, CEO of Secure Cloud Provider. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Lori. Now let's move into the questions. What are the most important considerations for Zero Trust?
I would say the single most important consideration for Zero Trust is the data that you're protecting. Remembering that it's not about the identity, it's not about the network, it's not even about the logging, even though all of those are important components of Zero Trust. But what Zero Trust is intended to do is to protect the targets. And that target is typically going to be your data, right? I would say the second thing that's super important to remember for Zero Trust is the holistic end-to-end security architecture, which I just alluded to a moment ago, that identity, network, logging, et cetera, are all components of that. But it's going to be that holistic framework that really matters, and ensuring that you are crystal clear on what that framework is intended to do. The third consideration that I would say is really important is to understand it's not about what high-level concepts you can define or how you can talk about Zero Trust, talking about policy engines or talking about assume breach, et cetera. There's nothing wrong with those terms. And in fact, they're very much core principles of Zero Trust. However, the most important thing is being able to understand how to implement those principles in practice. And that is, I believe, where most companies fall short. They can talk about the principles, but when it comes down to the implementation and to the practice, down to practice, how are you actually going to implement your Zero Trust principles? They don't have that mapped out. They don't have a process, and they don't really know how to do it. So that is definitely a big problem.
That really highlights the foundation of Zero Trust, principles that ensure every access point is verified and secure. Now, let's look at how these same principles tie into cloud governance. What role does Zero Trust play in cloud governance?
Well, Zero Trust primarily serves as the framework against which you can measure your baseline standards as a company. And then when you have that baseline established, you can then map your cloud controls to that, and you can ensure that you're actually incorporating best practices for every single entity across the board. Remembering that Zero Trust is about establishing a secure baseline for everybody. So in other words, it doesn't matter which network they're in. It doesn't matter who you are. Best practices really need to be enforced for everybody across the board. And having that set of standards is what allows you to do that in cloud, to be able to compare your cloud controls to that and ensure that you're where you need to be.
So as we can see, Zero Trust is not just about technology. It's about setting strong standards for compliance and resilience. But how can organizations actually begin implementing it? What specific steps are involved in establishing Zero Trust in the cloud? And how can you know when you've achieved it?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because in reality, Zero Trust is not a static milestone, and you can never really say that you've achieved it to the point to where you no longer have to worry about any new emerging risks or threats. Of course, you always have to worry about those. As new types of threats even emerge, for example, AI. Today, AI can actually impersonate the human voice, right? There are things that happen with AI today that didn't happen, say, 5 years ago. So all of these new risks and threats, you have to make sure that Zero Trust also accounts for them. So in a sense, then you'll never truly achieve Zero Trust. But on the other hand, you can achieve Zero Trust maturity. For example, you can have a very robust monitoring system in place, and you can have a very robust incident and response mechanism in place as well, so that you can respond to whatever you're finding during your continuous monitoring. In terms of how you would implement it, though, I would say the first most important thing is to clearly define your company's standards and to ensure that you do it knowledgeably. So in other words, you're aligning your company's standards to the Zero Trust framework, right? And then once you have that done and you have your standard, then you evaluate your cloud, you analyze your cloud controls, your current state, and you check whether there are gaps and how closely the controls that you have in place in cloud today actually align to what you say your standard is. And when you find gaps, and you will, then you ensure that you enforce additional policies, that you have additional mitigations put in place so that you can address those gaps that you're finding. So essentially what you're doing then is you're bringing your cloud along to align to the standards that you have, and your standards in turn are going to be aligned to Zero Trust.
That's a great reminder that Zero Trust is a continuous journey, not a one-time goal. Let's now explore how this approach continues to evolve over time. How is Zero Trust continuing to evolve?
Oh, that is a really interesting and complex question. I would say we can start by looking at the past. In the past, people often solely looked at the network. Where are you coming in from? If we know the location you're coming in from, then we trust you and we'll give you whatever you ask for, right? Or in other cases, it was your identity. Do we know you? Oh, we know you. We trust you, so you can have whatever you want. Instead of looking at the whole package and saying, do you actually need to have access to that data regardless of the network you're in and regardless of who you are? And if you do need access to that particular data, then could you potentially maybe just have it for this particular use case, just-in-time access, for example, instead of simply getting what you asked for because of who you are and possibly even keeping it long-term, right? So fast forward to today, how Zero Trust has evolved security is it takes all of those components and works it into an end-to-end security architecture that needs to ensure all pieces are in place for the environment and, importantly, the data to be properly secured. So this alludes to a really important factor, which is it's become less about identity, less about network, and more about the data, the overall context, the analytics of everything that's going on, and that whole overall package that needs to be considered. So it's not just about the fact that new threats emerge, right? Which they do, and then Zero Trust, of course, has to evolve in keeping with that. But it's also about the fact that as our tools evolve and as we have additional integration, we expand our attack surface too. Any attack that happens, for example, in GCP is going to also potentially impact AWS and Azure if the three of them are integrated. So there are all of those considerations. And again, AI is huge as well. All of those considerations in terms of how Zero Trust is evolving.
It's exciting to see how Zero Trust is expanding beyond networks and identities to cover data, workloads, and automation. But with the rise of AI, new challenges are also emerging. Is AI introducing any new concerns for Zero Trust in the cloud?
Yes, AI is definitely introducing new concerns for Zero Trust in cloud. The first thing, of course, is the fact that, as already noted, it is greatly expanding the attack surface. I think it's important to note that the APIs and the agents that AI leverages in order to do its job create, of course, new assets. And those new assets then need to be taken into consideration when evaluating what needs protected, right? Those can also leak data. Those also have access to a lot of data. So there's that component there. Another consideration is, of course, the level of integration that happens now that didn't used to happen. It didn't used to be that various data sets needed to be integrated, but now AI needs to have a lot of access to a lot of data in order to properly train its models, and this integration could result in data leakage. There's also new complexity introduced in terms of trust boundaries between humans and machine decisions. How much decision-making power do you want the AI to have? Risk could be automated at scale just as easily as security can be automated at scale. So there needs to be these checks and balances, and AI definitely throws a lot of complexity into that mix. So in summary, it's really important to remember that AI will continue to present new complexities, right? Both new risks and also new potential for security solutions. It's also really important to understand that Zero Trust does not encompass one single security aspect, but rather comprises all of them. It's the holistic end-to-end architecture that makes an environment and, more importantly, the data secure. It's also critical to have a robust, continuous monitoring solution in place and to know what to do about it when you see new risks emerge. It is possible for us to be ahead of the game and to be able to predict many threats, but we're never going to be 100% there where we never get taken by surprise. So having that team in place that knows what to do when these things come in is really important.
That wraps up this episode of the NextLabs Cybersecurity Expert Series on how to strengthen data security in the cloud. Thank you for tuning in, and be sure to join us for our next episode, where we'll continue exploring how organizations can stay secure in an increasingly digital world.